In this movie, I want to touch on the SQL Server 2012 hardware requirements. Now keep in mind, I don't think you're going to see very many questions about this on the exam. These type of questions historically have not been showing up on the exam a whole lot, but you could see one that kind of leans this way, and you'll need to know this for your own benefit for working with SQL Server in your environment. Also note that I have installed SQL Server 2012 in virtual environments on VirtualBox and on VMware Fusion and Workstation, and it worked great. So if you're working in a virtual environment, you can load this up and work right along with me. So let's talk about now the requirements for working with SQL Server 2012. Now the bottom line is the hardware and software, which we'll talk about in a separate video, requirements vary pretty widely based on the components being installed with SQL Server. Also on the database workload. Now the workload's not going to matter to us because we're not going to use these as production databases. But keep in mind, if you're in the real world, the workload is going to affect your hardware requirements especially. And of course, the processor class is going to be used. Again, not going to affect us a whole lot, but just have to watch for this in the real world. Now keep in mind that most of the published requirements out there for SQL Server, these things, all the data you're going to read is going to cover a typical SQL Server 2012 installation. And historically, any questions on any tests go back to that. Typical SQL Server 2012 installation. So that's what I'm going to show you here. For processors, you have 64-bit and 32-bit options. On the 64-bit side, AMD Opterons or AMD Athlon 64s. On the Intel side, Xeon or Pentium 4. Intel processors, you do need to note, must have EMT64T support. Just watch for that. Could be a trick question on the exam. And you're looking at least a 1.4 gigahertz minimum. Obviously, you want to go as far past that. Microsoft recommends a 2.0 gigahertz or faster processor. On the 32-bit side, Intel Pentium 3 compatible or faster. You do want to be faster. And a 1.0 gigahertz minimum. Again, 2 gigahertz or faster recommended for that. On memory, 1 gigabyte minimum. 4 gigabytes or more are recommended. And I can just tell you with SQL Server, the more RAM you can throw at it, the better. And the maximum depends on your SQL Server 2012 edition. Now, for disk space, you need to make sure that you have 811 megabytes free disk space for installation for the database engine. Then for analysis services, if you're going to use that, there's another 345 megabytes you're going to need. If you're going to install reporting services, you're looking at another 304 megabytes. Integration services, that's going to be another 591 megabytes. Client components, notice a whopping 1.8 gigabytes or 1,823 megabytes. So you can see, based on what you're going to do with SQL Server, it's going to depend on how much space you need. Suffice to say, you're going to need a fair amount of disk space to install this. Keep in mind, once this is installed, you're also going to need to then provide space for your data. And a lot of times when you're at the SQL Server level, you're probably in some sort of RAID type storage situation, and it's probably separate from your server. But to just set up and run this, you can run this just on a single server, and you can run it again in a virtual environment. Just make sure that your processor and your memory gives you enough to make this thing not be a total irritation to watch it crawl. Okay, so anyway, that's the basic hardware requirements. Just be generally familiar with these before you go take the exam. They could throw these at you, although on the warehouse exam, I would doubt you'll see them very much.